Hello and welcome, I hope you're well. So today I'm going to be tackling the all-important question, what are the best settings for landscape photography? So when I was planning this video, I actually thought it would be better to title this video, How to Choose the Best Settings for Landscape Photography. As quite simply, there isn't a quick one setting for every photograph scenario. Typically, it's a thought process that we go through to determine the correct settings. So I've broken this video down into 3 sections that we may encounter when we're shooting landscapes. I'm going to share with you my thought process on how I determine my camera settings for that given situation. During the video, I'll also be referencing some other videos I've made in the past that deep dive into particular areas of the camera settings process. I've put a link to a playlist to all of those videos down in the description, so if you fancy checking those out, feel free to take a look at the playlist. So the 3 different parts of the video are camera settings for wide angle scenarios, telephoto scenarios and long exposure scenarios. We're also going to be taking a look at some troubleshooting along the way as well. So let's dive straight into the video with shooting a wide angle scene. So as a starting point to any photograph I take, I always spend a decent amount of time figuring out how I wish the finished image to look. This pre-visualization stage will help me to determine later on how to select the best settings for that given scene. So a wide angle shot in many cases will include some foreground, some midground and then some background. And composing these elements is key to a successful shot. When I have my composition confirmed, it's now that I start to think about my camera settings. I think after all, it's pretty pointless thinking about camera settings if the composition's not right in the first place. I find breaking the image taking process down into smaller sections really helps me to keep a clear mind. So with my composition sorted, my next phase is to determine my depth of field. If you're not familiar with depth of field is essentially everything that falls within sharp focus in your scene. For example, if you focus on a flower, say at the front of your scene, and choose a very wide aperture, say f2.8, only that flower will be in focus and everything else will fall out of focus. This is known as a shallow depth of field. The opposite would be if you focused a third of the way into the scene and selected a very narrow aperture, say f11 or f16. This will get much more of the scene in sharp focus, and this is known as a large depth of field. Now, not in every case, but quite often with a landscape photograph, having everything in the scene from front to back acceptably sharp is quite a desirable option. With this thought process in mind, we can choose a narrow aperture for many landscape scenarios, and this will enable us to gain a large depth of field. But what we should also consider is at what aperture are lenses at its optimum in terms of sharpness. So many lenses suffer from diffraction when the lens is stopped down below f16. The aperture becomes smaller, the light diffracts as it passes through the aperture and it makes the image softer. This 18 to 55 lens is sharpest at f11. My advice would be to test your lenses prior to your shoot so you know exactly what apertures are the sharpest. It's also worth mentioning that the focal length affects depth of field. Generally speaking, the wider we are with our focal length, the larger the depth of field for any given aperture. The more we zoom into the image, the shallower our depth of field will become if we're still including a close-in foreground element. So, having determined that I prefer to shoot at f11 for the sharpest image quality on this lens here, my next step is to figure out if that actually gets everything in the scene sharp. Choosing the correct area to focus will have a big part to play. For example, focusing on the nearest object in the scene will likely give us the most shallow depth of field, whereas focusing a third of the way into the scene or even at infinity will often give us a far greater depth of field. If everything looks nice and sharp at my preferred focus point, I'm good to move on to the next step. If not, then I have to think about stopping down the aperture further to say f16, recomposing my shot or focus stacking. So focus stacking is a technique where we blend multiple images focused on different parts of the scene. Say one image focused on the foreground, one on the midground and one on the background, and then we blend those images together to create sharpness from front to back when we get to back to post-production. Again, I've done another video on focus stacking which is linked below. So I'm happy with my depth of field at f11. everything's nice and sharp and the composition's nailed down, the camera's locked down on the tripod, my next phase is to look at my exposure. Can I actually take the image with one single shot without adding a graduated filter or exposure blending? Now, every camera has a range that it can comfortably record data, and this is called dynamic range. If a scene has more dynamic range than the camera loses details in either the highlights or the shadows of the image. To compensate for a scene that requires more dynamic range than the camera, we can introduce a graduated filter like this, or we can blend multiple exposures together, which is often called exposure bracketing. I have a class over at my online photography club that goes through filters in great depth. If you fancy checking that out, the link is above and down in the description. Anyway, most cameras have the option to bracket photos automatically, and this is my preferred method when shooting digital. I do shoot film also, and of course you can't really bracket when you're shooting film, so a graduated filter becomes my preferred method then when the dynamic range of the scene exceeds that of the film. Let's say, for example, today that the dynamic range of the scene in front of us does not exceed that of our camera. So we're able to take a single image and retain details in both the shadows and the highlights. Now, the easiest way of seeing this is by examining the histogram on the rear LCD. Now, the histogram is one of the most useful tools when assessing your exposure. The histogram is a graph that shows the tonal range of the scene, with black on the left and white on the right. And if any part of that graph is touching either end of the graph, it means we're over or under exposing our shot. The histogram is a great way to see if we need to add a filter or introduce exposure bracketing. The histogram allows us to expose correctly when we adjust our shutter speed, aperture and our ISO. As we do so, the histogram will move and tell us when we're correctly exposed. I use both the histogram and the live view to set my shutter speed for any given scene. At this stage, my ISO is always at its lowest setting, which is ISO 160 on the camera that I use. So I've adjusted my shutter speed to get the correct exposure, my aperture is set, my ISO is set. I now need to assess how my shutter speed will affect my scene. And the real factor here is movement. Are things moving within the scene? And if so, do I need to freeze that movement, or am I looking to show that movement within the final image? And this kind of takes us back to the start really in terms of the pre-visualization stage. Maybe I've already chosen that I wish everything to be completely still, or maybe the opposite, to show motion. Whatever my choice, my shutter speed will dictate how that motion is captured. A slow shutter speed will show motion and a quick one will freeze it. We'll talk about long exposures in a bit, so let's assume we wish to freeze any motion we have within our scene. Quite often things such as foliage, grasses and water will have a big impact on determining the correct shutter speed. When the wind is added to a scenario with lots of foliage and grasses, they move like crazy. The more they're moving, the quicker the required shutter speed will need to be to freeze that motion. On a still day, it's quite easy to shoot a woodland image at say 1 second, but on a windy day, we'll need to significantly increase our shutter speed to freeze it. This assessment can only really be made in the field, and my advice would be to run a series of test shots to see how that motion is frozen at the different shutter speeds. Now, of course, we can't simply increase our shutter speed without it affecting the overall exposure. So to maintain the same exposure, every stop we increase our shutter speed, we'll need to compensate this by increasing our ISO by 1 stop as well. So ISO increases the sensitivity of the sensor to light, but the trade-off is that as we increase the ISO, the image quality starts to show more noise and becomes more grainy. Experimenting between ISO, shutter speed and aperture to get the cleanest image is key for the most desirable look. So now we have our exposure sorted, what else should we do to make sure we can get the most from a specific scene? Well, I would suggest shooting in RAW always, and this will record the most amount of information, and this will help when we get back to the edit. Shooting in RAW will also give us the most amount of flexibility for adjusting the white balance in post-production. I generally leave my white balance set to auto unless it looks really weird. Sometimes during the blue hour or sunrise and sunset, auto white balance may not look that great, and then maybe I'll change it. But for the most part, I leave it set to auto, and then if I need to adjust it later, I can do. The next step is to select the self timer. I usually use the 2-second timer for this, and this means that when I fire the shutter button, the camera will wait 2 seconds before it actually takes the photo. And this means that any camera shake that I introduce when I touch the camera will not be recorded in the final shot. So let's talk about a telephoto lens. So shooting with a telephoto lens throws up some other issues that may affect our decision making when we're determining our camera settings. The good news is though that the procedure for choosing those camera settings is exactly the same as before, but with just a few minor tweaks or a few different thoughts. So we have our pre-visualization stage, composition, depth of field and setting the aperture, then the exposure, all as before. But this time we need to consider how to compose the image, as our depth of field will likely be a lot shallower if we're trying to introduce some foreground interest. Generally speaking though, with a telephoto lens, we're trying to pick out details within the landscape, and quite often these details fall on pretty much the same focal plane. And this is great as it often gives us an option of shooting at a wider aperture, say f5.6. The bonus here is that because we're letting more light into the camera with the wider aperture, we can also set a quicker shutter speed than if we were shooting at f11 or f16. And this means that we don't need to increase the ISO as much as if problems arise. One problem I often face when taking a telephoto image is camera shake. Even though I usually have my camera locked down on a tripod, wind can often move the camera during the exposure, making for a soft image. The more zoomed in we are, the more any micro jitters will be accentuated, meaning a faster shutter speed will be required to eradicate any of that camera shake. And this is why having a wider aperture really helps. I'm also happy to boost my ISO a touch if need be, and I would suggest that it's more desirable to have some digital noise in the image than a soft or blurry image. Noise can be corrected in post-production, but camera shake just can't really. I also quite often choose to use the 10-second timer when I'm really zoomed in, as sometimes a heavier telephoto lens can take a little while longer to settle on the tripod after I've pressed the shutter button. So let's talk about long exposures. So choosing the right settings for long exposures can be quite challenging, especially in windy conditions. Again, my thought process is the same as before, but obviously during the pre-visualization stage, I've made a decision that I wish to allow the camera to record some movement within the scene. This time though, I have to assess what it is that I wish to be blurred and how much of that motion I wish to introduce into the photograph. This will be dictated by the speed of the movement and the length of the exposure. Slow moving clouds, for example, will require a slower shutter speed than a fast moving wave in the ocean. So again, the thought process here would be to determine how much movement you wish to introduce and experiment with different shutter speeds to achieve the desired look. Quite often, conditions will be too bright to slow the shutter speed down to show motion within the scene, and to prevent the lens from diffracting the light and stopping the aperture down too small, a filter can be added to reduce the amount of light reaching the sensor. And filters come in varying strengths. I've got a 3-stop, a 6-stop and a 10-stop neutral density filter, and adding one of these will reduce the amount of light entering the camera, meaning we can obtain a longer shutter speed. The longer the shutter, the more movement the camera will be able to record. I would suggest composing the scene as before with the correct exposure. Say for example our correct exposure at f11 was 1/30th of a second. Adding a 3-stop filter would lengthen our shutter speed by 3 stops from 1/30th to 1/4 of a second, meaning more motion will be recorded during the exposure. The two biggest problems I've encountered during long exposures are wind and camera movement. Any movement to the camera during the exposure will result in a blurred shot. So shielding the camera with your body and weighing the tripod down during the exposure can really help here. Soft sand as well can also play a massive part in a blurred image, so I would pay careful attention to this when you're at the beach. Wind can also be adding movement to areas of the image you wish to be sharp. For example, taking a shot of a river on a windy day can be quite problematic, as the slow shutter speed will not only introduce movement to the water, but also to the foliage as it moves in the wind. The only way to get over this is by taking 2 exposures, a quick one for the foliage and a slower one for the water, and then blending those 2 images together when we get back to post-production. It just so happens that I've done a video all about that, and that's in the playlist too. So guys, a massive thanks for watching this video. I do hope you got something from it. Be sure to check out the playlist for more, and also if you fancy checking out my online classes, you can do so by following the link in the description to my photography club. There's heaps going on over there, from monthly galleries, my exclusive monthly videos, community message boards, so feel free to check that out if you fancy joining the community and supporting what I do here on YouTube. Anyway guys, until next week, see you soon. Oh, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already, and like and share this video if you think others might like it too. Anyway guys, see you next week.